Welcome to the 73rd episode of the Hail Mary podcast. I'm A. Toves, and I'm joined by my husband, the Toves. We're back to review our first ever bowl victory. Let's get started. This game certainly didn't go as expected. We thought we'd see Frank Harris lead the offense out one last time, but the morning of the game, we learned that Frank had sustained a shoulder injury in the Tulane game and couldn't play. Instead, we saw a passing of the torch as Owen McCown got his first start of the season. The offense started out rough with the first 5 drives ending in either a punt or an interception. Marshall capitalized on the first turnover, scoring a touchdown 2 plays later. They added another touchdown on a 64-yard run by Rasheen Ali. With Marshall up to a 14-0 lead early in the second quarter, it seemed like this could be another missed opportunity for UTSA to win a bowl game. But I should know to never count the Roadrunners out. Finally, the offense came alive, scoring a pair of rushing touchdowns from Robert Henry and a touchdown reception from Josh Cephas to give the Roadrunners a 21-17 lead going into halftime. In the second half, it was all Roadrunners. The defense came out strong, holding Marshall scoreless and coming up with an interception by Cam Alexander. The offense added touchdowns from Rocco Griffin and David Amador. In the end, the Roadrunners achieved their goal, winning the first bowl game in program history, 35-17 over Marshall, and ending the season with a 9-4 record. What were your thoughts on the game?
It was just bizarre. Everything just seemed bizarre leading up to the game and then within the game. First of all, as you mentioned, the news broke that Tuesday morning that Frank Harris wasn't playing. So it kind of just feels like that first sentence you had of the summary was perfect. The game certainly didn't go as expected because it already started off with a head scratcher, right?
Right. I mean, everyone was expecting Frank, but it makes sense now when you go back and you look at the performance in Tulane. I mean, he seemed off. Even though they showed that play and it happened, I think, in the second quarter.
Yeah.
He seemed off that whole game, and so maybe he was, I don't know, maybe he had hurt his shoulder earlier and it just aggravated it, made it worse, because that play didn't look like it was that dramatic, but it makes sense now why he wasn't getting the production that I think he wanted to get during that game.
Absolutely. And so then we get Owen McCown, we ended up taking a picture with him afterwards, which we could talk about a little bit later, but did not look doe-eyed, I would say, but no. It kind of made the matchup a little more intriguing because you had, as we had talked about in our preview, Chad Pennington's son, Cole Pennington, was starting for Marshall, and now you had Josh McCown's son starting for UTSA.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is those two were very briefly teammates on the 2008 Miami Dolphins team. I think Josh McCown was only there for the off season, but nonetheless, just to see those two former teammates with their sons playing against each other, an interesting story.
Yeah, and ESPN again, has kind of played that up a little bit. So again, bizarre things that are happening, right? Like now all of a sudden we get this kind of cool matchup as we, already mentioned. But then here's another bizarre thing that happens is, okay, we have our zero on offense. Frank Harris is out. Now Rashad Wisdom during the game ends up breaking his arm and ends up going out, right? Yeah. And so then they kind of walk off the field together because Frank had walked out there, and there was where we were sitting. It was kind of interesting because people were like, "No, Rashad Wisdom's standing up. No, he's right there." But it was actually Frank, and you kept telling the people next to us.
I was like, "No, Rashad's on the ground. Frank's standing up. That's why you see zero." But yeah, to see them kind of walk off the field together, again, wasn't the way that they wanted this game to go. I'm sure, they both thought this was going to be, kind of that capstone for the two of them, but I'm glad that we were able to give them a victory to walk away from.
Right, and it certainly wasn't the way we wanted to see them walk off either. Sure. Coach Traylor talked about this, someday they'll make a movie of this whole season or whatever, and it feels like sort of that Hollywood ending, right, where the both of them kind of walk off, like almost arm in arm, because, they've just been kind of tied together. Even though they went to different high schools, it just seems like those two have been tied at the hip forever. So it was just kind of weird not seeing your two zeros on the field on either side of the ball. Here's another weird thing, and again, the bizarre game continues. You have Rasheen Ali, who's the star running back for Marshall, plays the first half, scores, as you said, that 64-yard touchdown.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't see him in the second half. And there was really no explanation. I didn't notice it, during when we were watching the game there live. And then when we rewatched it, the ESPN announcers, no one really said anything about it. They just saw him on the sideline.
Yeah, and then finally when they did, they implied that it was a coach's decision and, made it seem like, okay, maybe this was an opt-out, but the coach was taking, kind of the blame for it, if you will. And,
right.
And Coach Huff had mentioned at one point, we're trying to limit his number of carries or his pitch count. And so, the storyline you were left with was that, maybe he had just agreed to play the first half, or he only agreed to play for part of the game. But it just seemed odd because the team was struggling so much in the second half and their offense just seemed to really stall without him. But then later on, as we were preparing for the podcast, I found 2 articles, one by Underdog Dynasty and one by the Charleston newspaper, that referenced the fact that he had sustained an injury during the game. And they both quoted Coach Huff saying, "One of those plays, something happened, and the trainers told me he was unavailable. We had planned to kind of have him on a pitch count anyway, just because of where he's been this season, and I think he went over that." So basically, for those of who may not know his history, he was injured for part of the season. I think he had an injury last season. He's an NFL prospect, so that was why they were thinking maybe he might opt out. But those 2 articles were the only ones that really referenced an injury, and maybe it wasn't really a significant injury. It might have been something like he just tweaked something and they thought, okay, let's just stop now before he really hurts himself. But
right.
Kind of interesting that narrative hadn't really popped up anywhere else. I mean, I didn't see anybody on Twitter talking about an injury or anything like that.
Right, and I think that did change the game,
sure.
Whether you're a Marshall fan or you're a UTSA fan, because that second half, as you said, it felt like the Marshall offense sputtered when they really needed somebody to get them those yards. They didn't have that workhorse.
Right.
Even Coach Huff said he pretty much said, look, it changed a lot of the offensive schemes we had. We had to go into different personnel that we hadn't really, it sounded like they really hadn't practiced on.
Right.
Of course. So I'm not really sure about whether there really was a pitch count for him, because it feels like they had sets that they were still going to run with him, because I think they still really wanted to win this game, and I think they were still in position to do so. But, not having your workhorse, that could have been UTSA's story too, because because we were missing Frank Harris, that could have been the same storyline here, where, well, we got a pretty good performance from Owen, but it wasn't enough to win the game.
Right.
Now, that's not what happened, of course, but you get it if you see it from that lens. Another bizarre thing from this game was that UTSA loses their turnover battle 3-1, yet still win the game.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, when you hear about a team having 3 turnovers, the storyline doesn't end well, or just in general losing the turnover battle, right? You just expect that to be the narrative on the losing side, not the other side. But Marshall only capitalized on one of our turnovers.
Right, and we capitalized on the one turnover you had, so essentially kind of negates each other, right? That really seems to be, it adds to the story of the game, where Marshall left a lot of points on the field. So one last thing that was kind of bizarre, for a game that many people feel like maybe doesn't matter, things got chippy. Now the refs let it get chippy because they weren't really throwing flags.
Yeah.
But it felt like there was some extra pushing, but it's both ways. Let's not candy coat it for just saying that UTSA is innocent here. But there certainly was a lot of extracurricular activity occurring.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm surprised that it actually didn't get more out of hand, to be honest with you. And certainly UTSA was, I don't know, maybe a little bit more at fault. It seemed like we tend to like to trash talk.
Yeah. I mean, our coach is emotional.
Yeah.
They play with emotion. It happens. There is certainly a lot of gyrations and celebrations after, some big stops. And look, I mean, you want some emotion in the game, but it can also cause some ebbs and flows within the game too. So
yeah, and just on your point earlier about these bowl games not mattering, like it's interesting how that's been the narrative the last couple of years when we haven't won. Like, oh, bowl games are just like exhibition games. They're not that important. It's the championships. But there sure as a heck was a lot of celebrating from the same people who were like, oh, bowl games aren't important. Well, if they're not important, then why do you care that we won? Just saying.
It's a fair point. But I will then tell you that our friend Christy had kind of mentioned to us, like after the bowl game, that we weren't really seemed to be as celebratory
right.
After this bowl win as we would have been, like, say, after the championship games. And I don't think that it wasn't that it didn't matter. It just felt like a sense of relief. Like we finally checked off this box of saying, we got this monkey off our back.
Well, for me personally, the way that the game started had me, like I said in my recap, feeling like, great. Here we go again. Like, this isn't going to end well. And so once it became a reality that we were going to win this game, like, I don't know, I certainly felt a sense of relief. It was like, thank God we pulled it off, But I will be the first one to admit, bowl games matter to me. I think they're important for the team. I think they're important for the program to show that they can win these games. I know I might be in that minority, but certainly was very happy, but it was that just overall sense of relief in the moment because there were just some times in the first part of the game where I thought, I don't know if this could be the reality, where the championship games, I never felt that way. I felt like we had it, we were going to win those games or from early on.
I think you summed up my feelings as well too. I don't know. I like bowl games. I think the more college football you can have, the better. And I think taking on teams that maybe we normally wouldn't on a G5 level. Sure, it's great to play a P5 team, but playing other good G5 teams give you an opportunity to kind of say, are we as good as some of these other G5 teams? And there had been some chaos before in previous, bowl games. And I won't go through all of them, but there had been some chaos, but it felt like always excuses as to why we didn't win.
Right.
This one, again, you have the bizarre events, as we've already talked about. You have Frank Harris now all of a sudden not playing, even though the team knew. Again, Trailer mentions that it's the greatest secret they've ever kept. But, I think to add to that is they kept the secret, they drop it, and that could have been what sunk this team, but it didn't. They instead rallied, and that was something that I think is good for the team moving forward. It's, as you said, these bowl games can be great for the program and to show many things. And to me, one of the things that I think we'll circle back on is the fact that they rallied around someone other than Frank to help them get this win. So let's go back real quick because we did predict a much closer game.
Yeah.
And I think all of the reasons that we put out, or at least have already kind of talked about in terms of the bizarre events that happened before and during the game, I think really changed the narrative of where we were going with our predictions.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, if we had known that Rasheen Ali was only going to play one half, if we had known that it had been Owen playing, that might have changed kind of the predictions. But again, we ended that first quarter with it being, a 4-point game, or not the first quarter, sorry, the first half with it being a 4-point game. And it felt like, okay, maybe this is going to be a little bit more back and forth than what we thought.
Yeah.
But fortunately, that second half was, like I said, it was a very different game.
Right. And again, factors to that as to why that happened. But, looking back at the game, I don't know that knowing those things moving forward, we would have really changed our score predictions too much. I think, looking at this Marshall team, as much as it's 6-6 team, that defense was still really good. And that's what we wanted to impress on any of the listeners that we have, is that, look, you're not facing a team with a bad defense. You're facing a team that's got a very good defense. Their offense is a bit in chaos. And we'll go through some of the things that, UTSA did on the opposing side of each ball that I think contributed to the wins, but I don't know. I don't know that I would have changed my score prediction much. Maybe lowered it a little bit. I'm glad I'm wrong though about it being close. It's probably, you didn't need the heart medication that you had said in your prediction.
No, I only had a couple of those moments really in the first quarter, but the other thing was it was really nice at the end of the game that we were able to go on the field. Because
Right.
we didn't get that opportunity with the South Florida game because it went so late into the evening and it was a Friday. I thought that was a nice way to be able to get on the field and celebrate. And it wasn't something that they had expected. Somebody from the UTSA staff had mentioned they didn't think that they were going to allow the fans on the field. Again, it was fun. We were able to, like you mentioned before, take a picture with Owen and just get to see some of these guys and kind of interact with them on the field and see how they were celebrating with each other. And so it was just kind of a nice way to finish off the season.
The defensive linemen smoking cigars and
Yeah.
then taking pictures. Mostly, was it Nick Booker Brown? I think JB Buxton, I think, was one of the other ones. And I want to say it was either Brandon Brown or Matterson. I could be wrong. But
Probably both of them.
it was a lot of the big dudes, big nasties on the defensive line that were proudly smoking those victory cigars. And, they earned them. They certainly earned them through their play. I think looking back, being able to celebrate was terrific, but real quick, Traylor talking about the coffee coming down his crack had to be like one of the great moments to celebrate within the first bowl victory.
Yeah, I mean, you want to talk about bizarre things that happen. Like, we'll always have that comment from Traylor.
Yeah, we just happened to be on the field when that happened, and it was like, I stopped for a second because I was like, did I really hear what I thought I heard? And you have video
Yes.
of like us being on the field
At that time.
And there was certainly a lot of laughter, but it was great just kind of looking back, seeing all the UTSA fans were there. Obviously, not a lot from Marshall's side. It's a long way to travel, but from the UTSA side, I would say that it was the normal familiar faces that we've seen when we've traveled to many an away game this season.
Yeah,
that
the die-hard fan base that tends to go to most of the away games.
The sickos, I guess,
Yeah.
the college football sickos. It was fun to see all of you. If we got a chance to talk, obviously, always fun, catching up with many of you, and obviously love the fact that many of you listen. So let's get to the offensive side of the ball. The key to the game that I put there was finished drives. I previously talked about the last 3 bowl games where just hadn't been able to finish any of the drives and put up points. In this game, it was actually only had 5 scoring drives out of 14 total offensive drives. Actually worse than we had done in 2020 and 2021. Better than we did last season against Troy. But I think it really came down to the fact that in third down conversions, and that's not something that I really put into, I think, in the preview, but in the previous 3 bowl games, they were combined 6 for 10 in third down conversions on the first quarter. But after the first quarter, only 2 for 20. And in the last 2 games against San Diego State and Troy, they were 0 for 13 converting third downs in this, essentially after the first quarter. You're not extending drives. You're not getting first downs. Your offense is sputtering. It's not allowing your defense to get some rest. It's not allowing, the defense to be able to take advantage of, being ahead or anything. So that really, I think, contributed to the fact that there was losses the last few seasons. Mm-hmm. This season, it really felt like, look, you end up 1 for 5 converting in third downs in the first quarter, but 6 for 9 the rest of the way. And that's really what was the story of the second quarter, was the fact that I think they go 3 for 3 in terms of, converting their third down conversions. But they had big plays. And, you talked about the fact that there is a slow start. The last 3 games they've actually started, the bowl games, they started fast and then fizzled. This game, they started slow and then came to life in the second quarter. So, to me, I thought it was really interesting to see them. And again, how they rallied. There was a lot of moments, especially when we talk about Owen McCown, who went 22 for 31 for 251 yards passing. 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. He had 8 carries for 28 yards. Had a 26-yard scramble. But he did have 1 fumble. Look, I think looking at Owen McCown, and I think some of the things, numbers that I've just filled your head with, I think it's easy to say that, he had a fantastic game. I mean, going 22 for 31 is still a pretty high completion percentage. Mm-hmm. But I think it was tough to look at Owen starting because it was always going to be tough to replace Frank Harris. there's like sort of a expectation versus reality
Right.
aspect going here, where you have whoever's going to replace Frank Harris is always going to be compared to Frank Harris. But we got to be careful with that because Frank Harris had 51 career starts. Seeing some of the things he sees, on, I would say, from opposing defenses, he's able to make adjustments quicker.
Right.
And I think he's able to work with said offensive coordinator. Owen or Eddie or name whatever quarterback potentially, would get there in the transfer portal and could possibly win the starting job next season. I think the expectations are just going to have to be a little bit different. Like,
Sure.
it's going to have, I think as fans, going to have to be careful of how we compare or when we compare Frank to any of these quarterbacks.
Sure.
I think, to me, if you're going to compare quarterbacks like this, Frank Harris, to one of these other quarterbacks, you're going to have to compare them to 2020 Frank or 2019 Frank.
Right,
No.
which I don't think a lot of people really remember. When they think of Frank Harris,
Right.
they think of 2022 Frank. Like
Exactly.
That is the epitome of Frank Harris, and it's hard at times to go back and remember that was not the guy that we saw in 2020.
Right, you saw a guy that was pretty good, which is I think what you saw from Owen McCown. Pretty good. I mean, look, Owen had some moments of what we would say greatness, right? Like that 41-yard throw to Tyke. Tight window, put it right there for Tyke. Those are the moments you're like, oh, wow. Then showing some of the scrambling skills, right? Like, I know I've talked about it with you off the pod, but you don't really need a Frank Harris type of like scrambler or runner. You just need a guy that can, sidestep the pressure and then be able to deliver the ball. And that was the thing, was that I thought Owen did a good job of that, throughout the game.
Yeah, then there are those moments where you remembered he's a redshirt freshman.
Yeah.
You have the time where he's forcing that throw to Tyke when Tyke's being covered by Micah Abram, which is Marshall's top cornerback, and of course it gets intercepted, and you think,
Right.
Okay, did we force that to Tyke because that was the game call or the play call, or was that just a judgment error where he should have gone to his next read?
Right, and Traylor said afterwards that he checked to that throw. It looked more like he left it short. Like, it felt like Tyke was supposed to be on the outside, and instead of throwing it outside, Owen left it inside, which was right where Micah was.
Right.
So, probably one of the easier interceptions of Micah's career. But, looking back, because we were so close, and especially we sat close in the first half of the game before we kind of moved higher in the second half, we saw some moments with Owen, especially that you wanted to highlight.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, when you look at Owen, and people will naturally compare him to Frank, they're very different in terms of their personalities. Frank is that very extrovert, and Owen seems much more introverted. He's very even-tempered. You didn't see him get upset when he had those 2 interceptions. Like, you would have seen emotion from Frank, and Owen just really kind of kept it together. But I thought one of the things that showed Owen's leadership that we were able to see on the sideline was that it was either the first or the second interception. He walked over to the defense and kind of thanked them. And he was kind of shaking, doing knuckles, shaking hands, whatever. And you could tell, he was showing them, thank you for basically coming through. I think it was the second,
Yeah, I think it was the second
interception. And, getting us back, to a place where they could kind of turn the tide. And then you saw him after, multiple offensive plays, going up to the, offensive linemen and, kind of thanking them. And so you can see he's got that quiet leadership. So he's not going to be somebody like Frank who's going to be really outgoing and maybe as comfortable in front of an audience. You could see that he was bonding with these guys and he was building that kind of level of rapport that you would expect from your quarterback.
Yeah, and I like the way that you kind of made the differentiated Owen from Frank, because even when we took that picture, Frank would have been like, oh, yeah, absolutely, blah, blah. And Owen was much shyer in the way he kind of looked at us and was like, oh, yeah, you really want a picture? It almost felt like you really want a picture with me. And it's I do want a picture with the first quarterback to lead us to a bowl victory, right? There's something big about that. Whatever happens to Owen moving forward doesn't matter to me. This was his night, and he had a good night in terms of leading the UTSA offense to to help them get the victory. Now he did have you mentioned the 2 turnovers, the 2 interceptions, had a fumble. Oscar seemed to just not hang on to that first throw and popped it up in the air and it got intercepted. I wouldn't say that was on Owen at all. It looked like just some stone hands from Oscar at that moment. It happens. And then he seemed to kind of gotten into some rhythm because it felt like we started going. But even then, there was like you had mentioned that there was punt, interception, punt, interception, punt was the first 5 drives. 4 of those were 3 and outs. Excuse me. And looking back at that, again, you could make the argument that, and only you kind of already made it, is that just kind of derails UTSA moving forward. But the fact that they were able to rally again there, for him to start getting some momentum as they, kind of move forward, after Marshall's up 14-0, it just felt like it felt like he knew how to handle himself. And I don't know, like I said, I don't know what happens to him moving forward, but what I do know is that there are a lot of good qualities, and you do feel a little bit better about where the quarterback position potentially is going to be moving forward. I think we always think of Owen, we see like a little better passer than Frank, but maybe not the scrambler that Frank is, and maybe doesn't have the awareness that Frank does, but the hope is for him to have greatness. And, he was helped out certainly quite a bit by, I would say, the play calling, because the play calling got a little bit more conservative. It was shorter routes, and they, I think, looked at ways to stay away from Micah Abraham.
Right.
I think that was one of your frustrations early on was, you did mention to me, it's like, why do we keep going at Abraham? And I was like, I don't know. Like, I have no idea.
Yeah, and the announcer said the same thing. Like, honestly, everyone expected Abram to be on Josh Cephas, but in the first half he was playing on Tyke, and yet we seem to be going to Tyke, even though, that's who was defending him. It's like...
we just kept tempting it, right? Like, it's just like we're playing with fire. And, we ended up losing a couple of battles there. And it wasn't until Tyke switched sides, essentially, that he essentially was taken by the less talented cornerback, and then Tyke started making some plays. But let's talk about Josh Cephas real quick, who ends up being the offensive MVP. 7 catches and 102 yards and 1 touchdown to end his career with UTSA. He ends up the single season career receiving yards leader. I think he also ends up with the career receptions leader. I think what hit me after the game was just how much we'll miss some of these players.
Right.
In particular, Josh Cephas. And we'll probably talk about it more when we review the season, but after seeing how he handled himself in this game, he did not look at all at any point worried. He seemed very level-headed too. And compare that to Tyke, who, again, somebody I think that we're going to end up missing as well.
Yeah.
I ended up talking to Jared from Alma Audible at halftime, and on Josh Cephas' touchdown catch, he talks about how Tyke was down the field and made such a great downfield block, and he said it was just chef's kiss.
Yeah.
And it started getting me thinking, because it's like, those are the things that really don't show up in the box score, and I think even Jared said as much on their podcast. But the thing is that, like, those are the plays that your role players make that you just forget about when you look back at their careers.
Yeah, I mean, Tyke obviously had the best season of his career this year. But again, it's those little things, when you have to look at the PFF scores to notice, or really be focused on him during the game. I mean, those little things made a huge difference in several games. And, those are the little things that a lot of times I think players take for granted because they want to be the one making the touchdown. They want to be the one making the big catch. But that goes back to kind of Traylor's discussion about, the culture of the team, where you have to put the team first.
Right.
And that sometimes that means being the guy who's making the great blocks for the other guy who's making the touchdown,
And little fact here, but Tyke's downfield block was on one Micah Abraham, the top corner for Marshall. So, when looking back at these two guys, there's a lot of things that you'll miss, and it's great to kind of look back at this game and see just the impact that both of them had. But I think Tyke, he always called him potential, right?
Right.
And we kind of joked about it before too. He had a rough rough like bowl game last year against Troy, but to see how he grew this season and to see how he finished the season and the game, I just really impressed with Tyke. Forever I think it's maturity. He really grew up, and I think really grew into a role that I think many of us didn't think he'd ever get to.
Right.
A young guy, though, that we need to talk about real quick is David Amador. You kind of talked about his touchdown, but he just seemed like he was destined to get that cross the end zone line, and he was not going to be stopped.
Oh, no. He definitely was working hard to get his first touchdown, and we've listened to Traylor, again, talk game after game about, Devin McEwen, and then kind of throw in. And David Amador, he's really great. We just haven't seen it yet. And so for us to see it in this game, I think was a really nice ending to his season. And then, again, if you go back and watch that pass, that reception, he just willed himself into the end zone. Like, he was not going down. So, again, great effort by him. And shows you, while we're talking about Josh and Tyke and, how much we're going to miss him, we've got David Amador, Devin McEwen. Hopefully they don't end up in the transfer portal, but, we've got them as our future.
Good point. One thing before we kind of wrap up this offensive section is the running backs, Rocco, Kavorian, Robert Henry. While we didn't really talk about them too much, the thing was they did the dirty work. There was a lot of rushing up the middle, a lot of frustration, I think in the first quarter where they couldn't find any holes, and Marshall was really dominating our offensive line, and then, it's just like we wore them down, and because of it, you didn't see like a huge run, but you did see some really good, I would say, body blows to that Marshall defense, and it goes without saying that in doing that, it kind of just opened some things up for UTSA and allowed them to kind of march down the field a little easier. Let me ask you this as we wrap up the offensive section. Based on what we already discussed about Owen and, potentially any other future quarterback and just the performances we saw throughout the offense, do you believe that this is the kind of the type of offensive scheme or production you think that we're going to see next season? Because we didn't get 400 yards. We ended up about 387, so...
Probably at first. I mean, you got to remember, whoever is the quarterback, whether it's Eddie, Owen, or, future transfer portal quarterback, they're not going to have as much comfort with the playbook as Frank has. They may not be as comfortable reading defenses, especially if it's Owen or Eddie, just because they're, those two are younger quarterbacks in terms of the amount of games that they've played. And I think you saw a little bit of that with Owen, where we do a lot of RPOs and maybe he wasn't as comfortable, pulling it himself and kind of hand it off to the running back when Frank probably wouldn't have. So, I think at least at first you're going to see that because they're likely going to try to simplify the playbook in the beginning so that whoever the quarterback is feels comfortable. And then, as we get to maybe the later part of the season, you may see, more offense or offensive production. But I don't think we should expect to see a return to 2022's type of offense right away. And again, you've got 3 really talented running backs. We assume we'll have some combination of 3 really talented running backs coming back next season. So, I think you're going to probably continue to lean on the run game, maybe more than we have in previous seasons.
I agree. I think that it's not going to be the 450-yard, offensive performances that we've been kind of used to, like you said, with 2022, and then at times in the 2023 season. But I do think that there's going to be a more reliance over more of a balanced, really good defense, and then playing good situationally offense. And it's shown through, as I mentioned before, in terms of third down conversions, that it really helped that they were able to continue to get those first downs and move this offense forward. Let's get to the defense. Keys to victory were get pressure on Pennington. I talked about how he had a 45% completion percentage and essentially no touchdowns, 3 interceptions when he was pressured. In this game, when pressured, he had a 33% completion percentage, 0 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. got to Pennington and, made him essentially pay for trying to, get a throw off when getting pressured. So didn't allow him to really get comfortable, I would say. Mm-hmm. Though I thought that without an offensive coordinator, I thought that they put together a pretty good offensive plan. It took some really big plays by this UTSA defense, in the passing game to keep them from really putting up some big touchdowns, because there were some really good throws downfield by Pennington that I think normally would have been touchdowns had our secondary not really stepped up.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at it, Marshall put up 367 total yards, but this UTSA defense created 6 sacks, 9 tackles for loss. They defended 8 passes, ended up with an 80% stop rate. So 12 out of 15 drives for Marshall ended up goose eggs.
Right.
They missed a couple of field goals. They just weren't able to get themselves going. Now, Charles Huff made some questionable decisions on offense. ESPN announcers kind of said, well, this is where you need an offensive coordinator to kind of talk him out of some of these decisions. But I find it hard to think that Barry Lunney or Will Stein or even Justin Burke is talking Jeff Traylor out of some play if Jeff already has his mind set to it.
Yeah.
So why would we think that someone's going to, tell Charles Huff, hey, let's not try to fake a field goal here. Or let's not try to do whatever it is, right?
Right.
They had a plan, and I think that it was pretty good. They just, I don't know, again...
They just didn't quite execute on some of their plays, and then, there were a few mistakes that, you just couldn't overcome.
Right. A lot of it coming from one man, Cam Alexander. Mm-hmm. He becomes a defensive player of the game. He had an interception. He had 5 passes that he did not allow a completion on.
I thought it was funny that, Traylor had asked in the post game, all right, who's going to ask Cam, why he didn't run that interception back for a touchdown. And so finally somebody did, and Cam had answered, well, the Marshall players got back to me a lot quicker than I expected him to. It's like, man, you can't got to go full speed on those plays,
It felt like he took his foot off the gas a little bit. But, look, I'm not going to dog him too much, especially with the fact that, I thought it was a terrific interception.
Yeah, he really went for that catch. He had to jump up in the air and get it. And like they said, Pennington probably didn't think that Cam could jump that high and get that pass.
Well, but it wasn't Pennington. It was the back. It was the fourth-string quarterback. Right. But even then, it had to be forced. I think it was gonna probably be an interception no matter what, because 4th and 14, you're just trying to drive the ball down the field, and you had kind of mentioned before off the pod, like that usually becomes sort of a punting situation.
Right.
Where if you get the ball intercepted, it's intercepted, it gets tackled, and you don't lose too much out of it. But
you didn't expect to get a 50-something yard return on that.
Right. But it was just, things just came together on that interception, and just great blocking downfield also by this UTSA defense. Good job by them figuring out how to knock Marshall players, the offensive players, out of the way for Cam to be at least get a bit of a tunnel before everybody caught up to him and tackled him. But it then led to a 1-play drive where essentially we get a touchdown off of it, and I think that's just the story of this defense. Jamal Ligon plays another great game. I still go back to the fact when you had playfully called him out, and he ends up having just a great backstretch of the season, and it just, I don't know, whatever it was, it just felt like he played some inspired ball down the stretch.
It just really seemed like, especially in this game, like he was everywhere on the field. He ended up being the all-time leader in assisted tackles with 148 for his career so far. And all signs point to the fact that he'll be back next year, so that number's just going to grow.
Yeah, and, I talked about some of these secondary players made some great plays. Ken Robinson, I think throughout his career, he's just been underrated. In the 2020 season, I remember him dropping an interception in the First Responder Bowl, and it could have been a pick six there, but big drop by him. But he always felt like the odd corner out, right? Like he always felt like there was Tariq and Corey Mayfield, and then there's Ken Robinson too. Like it just felt like Ken was never given the same spotlight as these other two, but absolutely played another great game, and he's been kind of shuffling back and forth between cornerback and safety. So to to have been able to do that takes a special kind of player. You've got to be able to adjust your mentality a few times. And Ken has done it just throughout his UTSA career.
Yeah. Owen Pee-wee was the other one that I thought, again, if you look at his stats, they weren't necessarily impressive, but just watching him, he seemed like he was creating all sorts of havoc. His PFF scores, show that he really had a great night. I think it was like the second or third highest PFF scores for the game. But again, if you just look at that stat line, the number of sacks, tackles, whatever, didn't really show the story, but it was like, you constantly were seeing him, in the middle of the play, hearing his name called on the field. Just one of those guys.
And I'm starting to laugh, and I'm sorry. It's because our friend Christy, her sister, was just yelling out "Pee-wee, Pee-wee" like throughout the second half, and it was just, it was fun to see him flying around.
Maybe we're in the era of the Owens, Owen McCown, Owen Pee-wee.
It'd be great, right? Like I think both players are destined to have some good careers here at UTSA. One last thing before we start wrapping this piece up is that we had 34 guys play on defense as opposed to Marshall at 22. The depth was real. Marshall's got a really good defense, but to have UTSA play so many guys, and you had to because you lose Rashad Wisdom.
Right.
You kind of lose a couple of other guys, briefly for some injuries, but you had a bunch of different guys play, which I think is a great thing because of the fact that normally you wouldn't be able to play your freshmen, right? Because you could only play 4 games and that's it.
Right.
But they allow them to play the bowl games. So, and get them up to essentially 5 games for the season. So to me, that's big because you get these young guys a chance to play against different competition. You get them, being able to practice all these guys, bring these guys and get them some time, and playing against a real opponent, not just themselves. Big for this UTSA program.
Yeah, and on Marshall's snap count, I went back and looked, and 4 of their players played every single snap on defense. UTSA didn't have a single defensive player that played every single snap. Ken Robinson came pretty close, but no one played every single snap on defense. So that just shows you how we were able to wear down Marshall at some point because, again, you get tired playing all of those snaps. And we were able to keep our guys fresh and really do a lot of rotation.
Absolutely.
All right, well, you asked me kind of about the offensive side and the future. So how do you feel about the future of the defense based on what we saw in this game?
I think you emphasized it with how many guys actually played, and there was not as much drop-off. There were missed assignments. There were bad angles taken.
Sure.
That happens. Like, guys are trying to make plays and sometimes just take bad angles and position themselves incorrectly. I'm not too worried about it. What I'm worried about is how do you get up and play the next play? And I felt like, just as we were talking about right now, it was just you had a bunch of guys play, and it felt like you contained Marshall. And even when Marshall got some big plays on us, it didn't ever feel like this was gonna really get away from UTSA.
Yeah.
It felt like, okay, well, maybe we're going to get another field goal. We'll talk about their special teams here in a second, but it just felt the same way, I think, as an offense. There's a really good future. I was concerned about how we would get a pass rush. Really, I was concerned about the fact that Trey Moore normally was able to win his matchup. Here we had more of, I don't know that somebody was really always winning their matchup, but, the blitzes helped. And there was some really great moments, I think, from the defense where not having to play so many snaps, you're fresh,
right,
and you're able to get to the quarterback pretty quick. So Pennington really had a lot of this defense in his face because of how many guys they rotated. And, Marshall kept huddling up, so it wasn't like they had a quick tempo much of the time. So because of it, it just played into UTSA's strength.
Right.
So let's get to the special teams. I said a key to victory here was stay disciplined on the kickoff coverage. Because of the fact that we had talked about how Jaden Harrison was a big time returner. Did a really good job. I mean, he did have a couple of returns,
but they weren't for hardly any yards. So we really were able to contain him for the most part.
And we got a lot of consistent punting from another guy I think we're going to miss in Lucas Dean. I think we've just kind of gotten jaded by the fact that we normally get incredible punts out of him. And even when they're not incredible punts, usually they're better than a majority of punters out there in Division I football. And, looking at him, it's just going to be another big loss, I think, coming up for next season.
Yeah, hopefully the Australian punter that we signed this class will live up to the same expectations as Lucas.
I hope so too.
Although I guess we probably shouldn't put those expectations on him already.
Yeah. I think it goes back to the expectations for reality.
Right, exactly.
Same thing with Frank, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, on the flip side, Marshall just had a rough game on special teams. I mean, we talked about their kicker going into the game. His long is 44 yards. He matched that in this game. Because of some issues that they had in poor execution, he tried to take a longer field goal and it didn't work. And then I think he missed another field goal that was shorter.
Yeah.
It's just rough when you're 1-3 on field goals. Marshall needed those points to kind of get some momentum going in the second half and did not execute well. And then they had that fake field goal that was, again, very poorly executed. And on the flip side, UTSA did what we needed to do. There weren't any just absolutely spectacular plays on special teams, but there weren't any significant mistakes either. So, they did exactly what they needed to do.
Absolutely. Overall, just, I would say, a good UTSA win. Obviously, still things we could probably improve on, but nothing that I think that isn't something that would be, you couldn't correct by the time next season came around.
All right, before we go, we had National Signing Day the day after the bowl game. Not really going to get into that right now. We'll cover more of that in the spring after the February signing day. But we did sign a total of 15 players. Expect to see somewhere around 5 more before the spring. The other thing to kind of keep your eye on, there should be some guys hitting the transfer portal. Mm-hmm. Because they'll be processed, or starting to have those conversations with the coaching staff about what their chances are realistically of getting playing time next year. A couple of guys who hit the portal recently, Kedrick Cobbs, Kyle Eves, and Javon DeBon. Again, I would expect to see a couple more of those guys, hit the transfer portal in the next, couple of days. Also, we should be keeping an eye on hearing some announcements from super seniors about who might be coming back next season. And then the other position I think to keep an eye out on, we've already started to talk about this a little bit, but we expect to see a veteran quarterback coming from the transfer portal. Trailer made a comment on, I think it was the Jason Minnick show after the bowl game, that they would be looking for a veteran quarterback to come in and compete with Owen and Eddie in the spring. He said that he didn't think Owen's performance at the bowl game was good enough to just win the starting position outright. While I don't necessarily disagree with it, I thought it was pretty interesting to hear Trailer being that candid. In the past, he's been very careful about criticizing his players, and a lot of times he said that because the player may not be able to handle that kind of criticism. So I think that tells us a little bit about Owen, in that he obviously has some pretty thick skin if Trailer's willing to make that type of comment. But again, I would expect if they're going to have a veteran quarterback from the transfer portal signed, it would likely be before the spring practices start, so that person could, be here in the spring. So that'd have to happen fairly quickly.
Yeah.
Another big kind of piece of news that came out recently was about the NCAA 2-time transfer rule. We had talked about that, I think, on the last pod, and how that would impact the basketball team during that 14-day injunction period. Well, they came out and said that those 2-time transfers would be eligible to play for the rest of the season. So obviously that's big news for our basketball team. We'll talk a little bit more about Jordan Ivy Curry in a second. But the other thing that was interesting was that they said if a football player went into the transfer portal in the spring, that they would be eligible to play next season. So not really sure what kind of impact that might have on some of our players, but obviously that opens the door for some of the people who have transferred already to potentially hit the transfer portal again. Moving on to women's basketball, we had just an absolute heartbreaker of a loss to Houston in the Convocation Center, 64-66. We dug this hole where we were 20 points behind in the first half, and it was just too many baskets for us to be able to make up that difference.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were moments where they could have at least tried to tie it up, and they even took the lead at one point down the stretch, but it was a short-lived lead, and it almost felt like we just ran out of gas. With the fact that they had to come out of that such a big hole. So
I think the thing you have to talk about though with this game was that it was that breakout game for freshman Asia Proctor.
She was just on fire. Yeah. I mean, I talked about it before in terms of her just having a smooth jump shot and just kind of being somewhat automatic when it came to that mid-range jumper. And, in this game, I just thought she capitalized on, her offensive opportunities. Now, I think when you're watching her play, though, the area that I think that Coach Aston would probably say she needs to work on is her defensive assignments. Because I think there were a few times where she was playing a different defense than the rest of the team, and I think that's what got her confused a little bit, and I think it cost the team a little bit. Now that's the thing: are you gonna hit her with the what were you thinking? But on the other hand, she was doing so well on the offensive end that it was like that you're like, I guess I'll take it, but I'd rather you know exactly what your defensive assignment is.
Look, she led scoring with 19 points, but again. You have to remember she's a freshman, right? So there are going to be those times where they make mistakes.
But that's what makes it so exciting, and I think that's where I really wanted to get to was, look, she didn't because you could see it from the coaching staff's face, but the fact that we're getting this production from a freshman, someone giving us that spark, man, it's exciting. It's this team has some really good young talent. I've talked about it many times before, but can't emphasize it enough that just seeing these ladies really step up to the moment. Because then we go to, as we drove up to Frisco, we were listening to them play Oregon in Eugene, Oregon, and it ended up 61-48. Oregon wins that game. However, I would say a majority of the game, UTSA was within 3 points the entire time. They just could not seem to find that shot or the offensive output or the defensive stop to get them to either tie the game up or to find a way to take the lead.
Yeah, and again, you have Asia Proctor leading the scoring with 20 points. So for freshmen to have one good game against a P5 school is one thing, but to follow it up with a second good game against another P5 program is just really impressive. And the fact that we had the scoring drought from Kira White and Adara Udo hurt the team, and then to see, Asia Proctor kind of come through with some of that production and make up for the fact that those two were just not having, a typical night for themselves, I think was great.
It's just that these youngsters, essentially meeting that moment, they're not letting the moment get too big for them. They're going right at it, and it's just great. I love seeing it because then they go to Seattle and they cap off non-conference play with a 75-64 win over Seattle. A game where I felt like they got up big in the second half, and I was watching on the phone before the Frisco Bowl game. They just seemed like they left their foot off the gas a little bit near the end because they were up by at least, I think it was 20, 21 points, and they just looked dominant. They looked like when we talk about the UTSA football team looking bigger, faster, stronger than their opponent. They looked bigger, faster, stronger. And Seattle came out and had taken an early lead, but UTSA just seemed like they weren't phased at all. You could see them focused. You could see them they knew they could win the game. Let's just keep the game going so that we can make some baskets, make some defensive stops, and we can put this team away. Seattle chipped away at it, but overall, finishing up this non-conference schedule, being 6-5 right now without Jordan Jenkins. I think if you had told me this at the beginning of, or maybe at the end of the spring, and said the women's basketball team is not going to have Jordan Jenkins for the entire non-conference schedule, And who knows how much into the conference schedule, but for right now, not having her at all for non-conference, and for them to be 6-5, and then having played tough against Houston, and then some of these other losses being a little closer, just couldn't get over the hump, I wouldn't have believed you.
Right, yeah. They've definitely shown a significant amount of progress year over year.
Absolutely, and hopefully, they continue to, we continue to see this throughout the season, because I think, obviously there's going to be an adjustment period when Jordan comes back, kind of integrating her back with what the team's been able to do. But, man, so many really great pieces. Yeah. So many great pieces.
So their next game is the start of conference play, Saturday, December 30th at Temple. It'll be on at noon on ESPN+.
We'll be watching.
All right, men's basketball. Man, right after that women's game in Oregon where, we really had a great game, we follow it up by listening to men's basketball get so close to beating Oregon State. 65-66 was the final score. Just at the very end had, kind of an ill-timed foul that it was just heartbreaking. But the game marked the return of Jordan Ivy Curry.
Sure did.
He led the scorers with 11 points. And up until that, to the very end, this was probably the best team performance that we've seen from the men's basketball team all season.
Absolutely.
They just felt like they were all playing well. And you didn't see, one scorer with a significant amount of points. Like I just said, Jordan led with 11 points. But it just felt like they all played up to the competition in this game.
Yeah, absolutely. And Oregon State's not necessarily a great team, but you're not going to say, oh, we just beat an okay P5 team. This was big because it's also in Corvallis. Right. It just wasn't in the Convo. So, the fact that they got it big like that, and, we have our basketball teams out in the Pacific Northwest, playing pretty well.
Yeah.
It's tough to swallow that we lost, but I think, again, it came down to situational basketball where, you see the women kind of excelling more than the men are right now. Mm-hmm. And, you talked about the fact that it was an ill-advised foul, but, it feels like the women will have an ill-advised foul, but they find a way to overcome it. Mm-hmm. And the men, just at this point in the season, are not able to overcome those mistakes.
We were in position at the very end. We missed a basket, so...
And I think we missed a one-on-one, like a 1-and-1. Mm-hmm. So we missed that first free throw and then allowed Oregon State the chance to get the ball back. So, yeah, it just, again, situational.
Yeah, and then, they follow it up with this loss against Army at home, 53-63. And it was very interesting to see the contrast between these two, games. Like, where I mentioned in Oregon State, it really felt like they were playing really well as a team. In the Army game, they were not. You could see that. I don't know if they were just out of rhythm, if something else had happened. There were moments during the game where Christian Tucker was visibly angry at the team and, was yelling at the guys because they weren't getting back into a huddle for a timeout. So you could see kind of some cracks. And it wasn't, I'm not sure if it was because we just had multiple people having off nights, if something else had happened, but the team dynamic went from what seemed like this really great game at Oregon State to, okay, there's something going wrong here, and it just, you could see it in their shooting. They were off. You could see it in the way they were relating with each other. It just didn't feel cohesive. And I don't know exactly what happened, but we went on this long scoring drought. And it just...
Well, we rely too much on a three-point shot, and we're not great three-point shooters. But the other part to it is that Army, not being as athletic, not being as long, was just packing the middle. And instead of challenging those Army defenders to come out at them and guard them with mid-range jumpers, we kept relying on the three-point shot over and over. And they just, again, contrasted with the women's team, where the women find a way to move the ball around a little quicker. There's a lot of cohesive passing the ball around. And it sounds so old school to say, but, the women are able to do some one-on-ones at times and take their defender to the rim. But for the most part, they're moving the ball and they're moving about pretty quick. Mm-hmm. Whereas with the men, it just doesn't move as quickly. And that just causes our opponent to not have to defend as hard as they would be if you're moving the ball around, and you're moving it around more, I think, quickly, but also better situationally. And there was opportunities for them to score, but I mean, even when they drove to the basket, there were times where they were just blowing layups, and it was like, what's going on? Like, it just felt like quite the downer. And you said it to me during the game. It felt like a downer coming off of such a tough loss to Oregon State.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seemed like there was something off the court too that wasn't quite working, in addition to the problems that you saw on court.
I would also have to criticize Coach Henson here, though, is that Coach Aston would have changed the defense up by like pressing some more, or she would have changed something, and he didn't seem to ever change the defense.
Right.
They waited till like a minute left in the game and down by like 7 to start pressing.
Yeah.
They could have done that a long time before, and with a young Army team, they could have rattled their backcourt and forced them into some easy turnovers, getting some easy layups, easy, and ones, but they didn't do it. So, I think not only did the team just not have the energy and kind of felt like they were on holiday, it felt like Coach Henson and the coaching staff just let one get away where they could have used their defense to really put more pressure on Army and potentially make this a win, as opposed to this really kind of lopsided 10-point loss.
Yeah, absolutely. They've got one more shot at their last non-conference game. They're playing Prairie View A&M on Thursday at 7 p.m. in the Convo. It's also on ESPN+. All right, well, I think that about wraps it up for us. So thanks for joining us on the Hail Married podcast. I'm Atos.
And I'm the Toves.
We'll be back to recap the 2023 football season.
Birds up.